Hello, my name is Chris Parham, and this is for my final reviews 2022 for the Dynamic Media Institute at MassArt for Design Studio 2. And these two projects that I'm going to be talking about are dealing with human data and data human. So the very first project that I'm going to be talking about is a project and an app that I designed dealing with what happens to your data when you join a social justice protest when it comes to employment, your credit, housing, military service, college admissions, and how it affects first-time protesters. My Data Human project deals with the mental health of also the famous jazz musicians and how they were able to produce America's soundtrack called Modern Jazz starting in the 1940s bebop era. But we're going to start off with my very first project dealing with human data. And again, this is an app that deals with what happens to your data when you go to a social justice protest and how it affects your future. So basically, what I've got set up is basically a pro bono group of lawyers dealing with Harvard Law School, and the group is called MyDataMyRights.com, and it's basically an app that gets people help with social justice protests, but also pro bono lawyers help when it comes to, for instance, when you get arrested. And for instance, half the time, if you're a first time protester, when you get arrested, you are charged with a misdemeanor. But in a lot of cases during the social justice protests of 2020, people were being charged with felonies. So, for instance, this is my very first concept, and the first idea was called My Data, My Constitution. And I basically laid out the different kind of categories that deal with, for instance, people who are in prison and they protest, people who are also DACA recipients, people who are in the military. What exactly are their rights when it comes to a social justice protest? So again, this is my very first idea, and this is my final idea. And what I'm going to be talking about are actual protesters that I have involved in my project. Four young people who were involved in the social justice protests of 2020, and also how it affected their lives on a personal level. So, for instance, this is my second idea. And to your right, you'll see a sign up form, contact us form. So, if you are at social justice protests and you get arrested, you'll be able to contact this group of lawyers who will be able to help you out in terms of how do you protect your data? You know, how does a person protect their data in terms of even if you, for instance, the charges get dropped, you'll still be able to they can still hold your records, you know. So for instance, these are this is my proposition, and this is the introduction that I have as well. And also, these are the young people that I was referring to. A young lady named Tiana Arata and a young lady named Maxima Guerrero. She's from Tempe, Arizona, and the other young lady is from Los Angeles. And for instance, Miss Guerrero is a DACA recipient, and so she was arrested at a George Floyd protest, and they put her in ICE detention. You know what I mean? Which is basically kind of against the law, you know. But that's how the groups of protesters have been treated. And also, I also have two other people, D'Angelo Sandine and also Lee Percy Christian, who, for instance, that gentleman, he had to give up his rights, his First Amendment rights to protest to avoid going to prison. And the same thing with the other gentleman, where his information was used against him when he was trying to find a job, looking for a job. Because of COVID at that time, he was just frantic. He didn't know what to do. So he lost out on that job. So this is what I mean about how this can affect your data. So, for instance, these are my recommendations on what needs to be done when it comes to police reform and also when it comes to rights of protesters as well. And that basically saying that protesters have rights, but what happens to their data? What happens to their data when it comes to them trying to find a job and so on? You know, so this is that project. Again, this is called My Data, My Rights. This is an app dealing with, again, social justice protests and how you're able to get your information and not have it used against you when it comes to finding a job, when it comes to joining the military, when it comes to college admissions, when it comes to housing, and all these other things that deal specifically where your information can be used against you, basically in the court of law. So again, this is my project for that. My Data, My Rights. Again, this is an app that I'm putting together. And then my next project deals with data human. Does mental health and improvisation equate genius in jazz music? And this project is about how I decided that I wanted to find out the mental health of great jazz musicians like Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, Billie Holiday, and so on. And I found out some interesting things in terms of, for instance, um, John Coltrane had OCD. Art Pepper also had OCD. He was scared to look at blood. Miles Davis had psychotic episodes because of substance abuse and so on. But also, Billie Holiday, she suffered from depression. Nina Simone was diagnosed with bipolar disease. And a lot of these musicians, for instance, dealt with schizophrenia as well. So my thing is, how do they how does mental health and improvisation equate genius in jazz music? So this is one of my first concepts for the AR project that I'm working on for Data Human. Jazz is data, algorithms as jazz. And I'm basically talking about how, for instance, um, John Coltrane had an algorithm for giant steps that's still being used today. So my thing is, I'm basically trying to find out where does the genius come from with these artists in terms of mental health issues, and also how do they doing improvisation right off the top of their heads. So what I did was I also dealt with a study for the British Journal of Psychiatry that talked about how jazz musicians equate equate genius with improvisation. So, for instance, this is one of my other series as well with Billie Holiday. And this is, again, an AR project that I'm working on, augmented reality. And this is also a part of my second concept where I basically was talking about, I gave each concept a name. So in this case, it's called Giant Steps as an Algorithm. So I was basically trying to talk about how, for instance, with this study that was done for the jazz musicians, what they did was they did a whole bunch of different scales and research and so on that dealt with how jazz musicians were able to also look at the background as well. What kind of background did the jazz musicians have? Like, for instance, John Coltrane and Billie Holiday. Who was there suicide in the family? For instance, Art Pepper. He was one of those as well who dealt with OCD. But also, too, how do these musicians come up with these great concepts with jazz music and still especially living through segregation as well, you know. And this is my third concept, data human jazz as data. And again, what I did with this is I put up a lot of different things that talk about through the study that talked about how John Coltrane had OCD, how Miles Davis was dealing with a mental health issue, how a lot of the other jazz musicians as well were dealing with schizophrenia. Like I believe Thelonious Monk had schizophrenia as well, and a bunch of other musicians were dealing with these same kinds of issues. And here, what they're looking at is the diagnosis of Miles Davis, Paul Desmond, Gil Evans, Bill Evans, and a bunch of other jazz musicians as well. And it talks about how the bulk of them were dealing with depression issues, you know. And this is my fourth idea, data as jazz and improvisation. And here I was talking about basically how jazz musicians make up music on the spot, and where does that come from? How does it trigger? You know what I'm saying? Like in terms of how a jazz musician does his work, what triggers in the brain, bringing on that improvisation? So this is also part of my fourth concept as well. And this is my fifth and final concept, data human, mental health in jazz. Does mental health and improvisation equate genius in jazz music? And that's what I was talking about with this particular one. This is my final concept that I went with. And I have films as well of this project, of these projects, excuse me. So this is basically my project. I wanted to focus and deal with the whole idea of what makes improvisation and what mental health issues did jazz musicians deal with that equated that great music, that equated the soundtrack of jazz. And I basically was having I was basically talking about how, for instance, as you can see here, aims, method, and results, and anxiety disorders. Those are all a part of the studies for the British Journal of Psychiatry that was done in 2018 for the Cambridge University Press. So again, this is my project, Data as Jazz, and again, I had a bunch of different names for it, but the basic project dealt with how to, dealing with the whole idea of mental health. and how jazz musicians, they couldn't just go to see a psychiatrist. I just wanted to say thank you very much.